Leader of the Opposition, Mr Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We warned on Saturday that if the House passes the government's deal, it would be a disaster for our country. Now, as we look through the details of the bill, we see just how right we were. Page after page of what amounts to nothing less than a charter for deregulation and a race to the bottom.
That's why they like it.
A deal and a bill that fails to protect our rights and our natural world, fails to protect jobs and the economy, fails to protect every region and nation in the United Kingdom. This bill confirms that Northern Ireland is really in the customs union of the EU and goods will be subjected to tariffs. The Prime Minister said there would be no checks. That was Saturday. But yesterday, the Brexit Secretary confirmed to the Lords European Union Committee that under the government's proposals, Northern Irish businesses that send goods to Great Britain will have to complete export declaration forms. And today, the government estimates, and it's the government's estimate, that exit declaration forms will be between £15 and £56 per customs declaration. So the Prime Minister was, at best, and I'm being generous here, mistaken on Saturday. And Mr Speaker, the more divergence, the harder that border will become, and the greater danger that will put, or the risk it will put, the historic Good Friday Agreement.
Does he think we should still leave the European Union? Yes or no?
We are challenging this bill today, and that is the whole point of this debate. And as he well knows, my party's policy is that in government we would negotiate an appropriate deal with the EU and allow the people to decide the final decision on that. And Mr Speaker, this deal leaves open Mr Speaker, this deal leaves open the possibility of the UK crashing out of the EU without a deal by the end of next year.
Yes. I'm very grateful to him for giving way, and I don't disagree with what he said, but does he understand why those of us in seats that voted very heavily to leave, who stood on a manifesto in 2017 that said that we would respect the result of the referendum, feel very strongly that this bill must be allowed to proceed to committee stage so that we can engage in the detail of the debate and see if there is a possibility of getting a Brexit deal that protects our constituents? That for many people back home in towns like Wigan, this is an article of faith in the Labour Party and in democracy, and that those of us who are seeking to engage in the detail do so not because we'll support a Tory Brexit. Our votes at third reading are by no means secure, but because we want to see if we can improve this deal and keep people's trust in our democracy.
I do thank my friend for that intervention, and I also thank her and her colleagues, some of whom represent seats that voted heavily leave, for the engagement we've had, the discussion we've had, and the constructive way in which all that has been approached. I do understand the concerns in those constituencies and those communities, and I know that she will support the principle. She will support the principle of a customs union, which we have placed on record in both our manifesto and since then in the Labour Party. My own view is that we should vote against this bill this evening for the reasons that I've set out. I understand her view that it's possible to amend it in committee. That is always the process in Parliament, but my recommendation would be to vote against this bill. But I do understand and respect the way in which she's approached it and the way that she represents her community and her constituency. And I know that she joins me in being pretty alarmed at the way in which manufacturing industry is under stress at the moment, and in the event of not having a customs union, would be under serious threat of remaining in this country.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way on that point. Is he concerned that, of course, for many of those areas that rely heavily on manufacturing, the deal as it's been set out and leaving that customs union and single market inevitably mean tariffs, which inevitably means less manufacturing and less jobs in those areas.
I thank my friend for his intervention, and his constituency, which I know very well, was once a centre of manufacturing in Britain, but the government of Margaret Thatcher put paid to that. And he's right that in the event of tariffs being introduced on manufactured goods, in the event of WTO conditions, the opportunities for sales in the European market, which are obviously huge at the present time, would be severely damaged. So I ask colleagues to think very, very carefully about what I see as the dangers behind the Prime Minister's approach to this, because he doesn't offer a safety net. He doesn't offer a safety net. There's so many people trying to intervene. Can I deal with one at a time, please? Thank you very much. It's very kind of you. The Prime Minister doesn't offer a safety net.
At the very least, it's, if I may very gently say to the honourable gentleman member for the Isle of Wight, a tad tactless when he's just been advised that the leader is dealing with one first, immediately to spring to his feet. I enjoin him to remember his emotional intelligence. The leader of the opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I don't think there's any process that allows an intervention on an intervention on an intervention. I think you would probably notice it. I give way to my friend, the member for Ashfield.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Today, I am also minded to vote in favour of a second reading, not because I support that deal, but because I don't. And I want to improve the deal so it reflects the manifesto that I stood on, to respect the result of that referendum, but to leave with a with a deal that protects jobs and trade. Does he understand my motivation?
Can I say I thank my friend for that intervention, and having spent time in her constituency with her on a number of occasions, talking to people in her community, visiting factories and enterprises in the area, I fully understand her concerns and their concerns, and I commend her for her work in representing that area and the obvious friendship there is between her and all the people that she represents. I think she is a great MP. And, Mr. Speaker, her concerns are that she wants to represent her constituency and their concerns. I hope that she will understand why I believe this bill should not be given a second reading, but I'm also sure she will agree with me that to get this bill to debate less than 17 hours after it was published is a totally unreasonable way of treating Parliament, and I hope she will also join me in the lobby this evening in opposing the programme motion on this particular bill. Mr. Speaker, no wonder some of the Conservative benches are suddenly so keen to jump on board with this deal, because it opens the door to the no-deal exit that this House has voted against on numerous occasions.
For the right honourable gentleman for giving way. Does he understand that the reason why so many of his own side and our own side want to get this through is that we want to avoid no deal, and the best way to do that is to support this deal? So why won't he support it?
I don't know what happened to the honourable gentleman's maths, but so far 3 members have intervened who've expressed disagreement with the bill, but want to get a better deal in order to get a customs union, which is hardly the position he adopts. So I think you should be careful of assuming that all my colleagues over here, who are desperate to represent hard-up communities that have been so disgracefully treated by this government, are suddenly jumping on board with him, because I've news for him, they're not. Plain and simple. Plain and simple. This, Mr. Speaker, is a charter for a Brexit that will be good for the hedge fund managers and the speculators, but bad for the communities that we represent, our industries and people's jobs and living standards. In industry after industry, from chemical processing to car manufacturing, are all deeply concerned about the way in which this bill will operate.
I thank one for giving way. One of the reasons so many of us are concerned about the programme motion is how little time we have to bottom out quite when the Prime Minister tells us that things will be better if we leave the European Union. He himself just said that he would look at the work-life balance EU Council directive, but on the 2nd of September, Bay's already ruled out to me implementing that. It's a directive that would give people carers' rights, for example, care leave, that our constituents don't currently have. So does he agree with me that one of the problems with rushing this through is not just what we will lose, but what we will miss out on, that this Prime Minister will not give any commitments on?
I thank my friend for that intervention, and of course she's absolutely right that whilst the Prime Minister claims there is no intention in his mind to undermine workers' rights, I can't see into his mind, so I don't know, but that's what he says. My friend is quite right. There is no legal protection within this bill for a dynamic alignment on rights with the European Union, on consumer rights, environmental protection, workers' rights, and much else besides. So I just urge colleagues to think very, very carefully on how they vote on this particular bill tonight. I'll give way one more time, and then I will.
I'm extremely grateful to the right honourable gentleman because I treasure the interview he and I gave together before he became leader to Sky News, where the only thing we agreed on is that we should leave the European Union on democratic grounds. What has changed since he became leader of the Labour Party that he can't see that if he votes against this programme motion tonight, if he votes against the programme motion, he and his whole party will be seen as voting against delivering Brexit?
Parliament needs to do its job, and that's what we should be given the chance to do, not rushed into this 17 hours after the publication of the bill. And I would also say, as somebody who before I came into this House was a trade union organiser and official, that you don't give up what you've won, you don't give up what you've gained, you protect what you've got and try and get better in the future. This bill undermines workers' rights within our country and our society, and those that vote this thing through in any form in its present way will find that many of the rights that we've now got will be severely damaged.
Can I thank my right honourable friend for giving way? This place can be quite intimidating at times. I came here believing that people who sounded a bit posh and walked around with an air of entitlement somehow knew what they were doing. And if nothing else, I thank the Prime Minister for disproving that at least.
Well said.
I absolutely... Sorry. I was catching a breath. The Prime Minister wore me out getting up and down so much earlier on. Members on this side genuinely are agonising over the best way forward in reconciling constituencies that have very different views on Brexit. And I thank the Leader of the Opposition for the work that he's doing to try and retain that coalition. But regardless of where people come from, surely it's important that we make the information on the right information and on the right risk assessment. And isn't it wrong that the risk assessments have been incomplete, and actually the government's own advisors haven't even been able to rate their risk assessment because of the lack of time?
My friend is absolutely right. And as a former very distinguished leader of his local authority, he knows the importance of going through documents in detail and understanding and getting a chance to take advice on the implications of them. With the greatest brains in the world, and I'm sure this House does contain the greatest brains in the world, there's no doubt about that, 17 hours isn't very much to deal with 40 clauses and 110 pages of this legislation. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is trying to blindside this Parliament to force this deal through, and this Parliament must challenge him in doing that.
Thank you. Can I thank my right honourable friend for giving me way? But does he share my concerns that should this bill be passed tonight, it will open up free trade agreements with the US, which will have huge ramifications for our valued National Health Service and for the food that we eat?
I thank my friend for that intervention, and yes, it does. It does, because the only way forward for the Prime Minister then is to go on to WTO rules and then to seek a specialist trade deal with the United States. I don't know if he's noticed it, but Donald Trump does adopt an America First policy. That Donald Trump's attitude towards trade is most generously I can put it, as one-sided towards the USA. There's going to be no equitable deal with the USA, and those companies in the USA that want to get control of our health service will come knocking on the door to take over our National Health Service. So, Mr. Speaker, I will give way a little later on. This is a bill of huge significance and complexity. It will decide the future of our country and the future of our economy and the economic model that we follow. And to propose a programme motion at the end of this debate will mean that all 68 clauses got to be considered and voted on within the next, 24, 48 hours, starting this evening, is actually an abuse of Parliament and a disgraceful attempt to dodge accountability, scrutiny and any kind of proper debate.
Grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. Has he noticed clause 36 part 1, which says it's recognised that the Parliament of the United Kingdom is sovereign, and yet the Prime Minister will not give this Parliament of the United Kingdom the chance to fully scrutinise his proposals?
Well, indeed, my friend makes a very strong case there that a Parliament should have the opportunity to properly scrutinise what the executive wants to do. And I don't think the Prime Minister has really taken that into account in his botched and speeded procedure today and his obsession with getting all this stuff through in a few days. What the officials once said would take 4 weeks to properly scrutinise is now being done in 1 day. I simply say to colleagues on all sides of the House, ask yourself the question, why? So much for Parliament taking back control. Parliament is being treated as an inconvenience that can be bypassed by this government. And, Mr. Speaker, there is a crucial element to this. When we deal with major issues in this House, major issues in this country, we need the information and we need what... If you would hang on a second, I will deal with this, Mr. Speaker, that there has been no economic impact assessment whatsoever made or presented to this House. At the very least, this House should have that assessment and that expert advice in order to scrutinise this bill. The Chancellor of the Exchequer doesn't seem to think it's relevant that this bill and their deal needs this kind of scrutiny, even more so in the light of today's very dire public finance figures.
And he's absolutely right. There has been no economic impact assessment on the basis of this bill. So many of us have to rely on the impact assessment of the last bill, Theresa May's withdrawal agreement, which showed a detrimental impact on the North East in particular to the degree of 7% of our GDP. How can this be justified on our industry and our manufacturing in the North East, which is already so far behind the rest of the country?
Indeed, and my friend represents a constituency that suffered grievously from the industrial non-strategy of the Tory government, where SSI Redcar was closed down, where there are huge issues about manufacturing investment all across her region and her constituency. And this House knows full well, and if the members opposite cared to listen, they would know full well that what is proposed will damage manufacturing industry and therefore jobs, particularly in the North East, as the only part of the country that has a manufacturing surplus on trade with Europe and the rest of the world on the North East.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and the Prime Minister shakes his head. But every single member in this House represents people who voted leave and who voted remain. What nobody voted for was a wing and a prayer, cake and eat it, blindfold Brexit with no economic impact assessment on the biggest transformation of our economy in peacetime history. Does my right honourable friend agree that this is completely an unacceptable way to bring forward this legislation? It's not fair on this House, and it's not fair on the people who will lose their jobs as a result.
Commend my friend for what she said and the way she said it. We all represent people who voted in different directions in the referendum or didn't vote at all in the referendum. We all have to represent them. But in making decisions, these decisions, we have to ask ourselves this question. If this deal is good for our country, why haven't they, the government, produced a single scrap of evidence to show that this is the case?
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. I'm enormously grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman for giving way. Let me pay tribute to a former Labour leader, Tony Blair, who was the architect of the Good Friday Agreement, which delivered peace and stability to Northern Ireland, much needed peace and stability after 30 years of atrocious violence in Northern Ireland that affected all communities right across the island of Ireland. So I am extremely concerned that the Labour Party, the Right Honourable Gentleman and his colleagues have anxiety that the Prime Minister's new Brexit deal does in some way undermine the Good Friday Agreement and the achievements of it. So would he please take a few moments to explain his concerns? I think that's really important.
I thank the member for her intervention, and I'm sure she would agree with me, and I'm sure the whole House would, that the Good Friday Agreement was an historic step forward which has brought relative peace to Northern Ireland, and she's absolutely right. My concerns are that this bill does create a customs frontier between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK, something the Prime Minister told the DUP conference he would not do, when it clearly does. It does require the certification of goods before they'd be sent from Northern Ireland to the rest of the UK. It therefore does create a different trading relationship. And whilst there might not be an aspiration at the moment to put any physical customs point on road borders between Northern Ireland and the Republic, I just simply gently say this: the direction of travel is not a good one in this respect. And the member knows as well as I do that as soon as you start that, you end up with seriously undermining the historic achievements of the Good Friday Agreement.
Grateful to the gentleman for giving way. I just want to return him to a simple fact which I'm a bit concerned about with regards to where he's been on this issue. Does he recall that he sponsored once a bill to repeal the 1972 European Communities Act? Can he explain to us now why he has changed such that in this bill he will vote against repealing the 1972 European Communities Act?
Mr. Speaker, I also recall that I strongly supported the social chapter in order to try and bring social justice across Europe. And I just remind the honourable member of his historic achievement of bringing in universal credit and all the damage that's done to so many people in this country. The only economic evidence we can go on is the economic assessment carried out under the last Prime Minister, and that was clear. Yes, then I'll move on.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Does he not agree with me that we should not vote for anything that could make our country poorer? And this Brexit deal would do exactly that. Does he also agree with me that the previous referendum should have been regarded as illegal due to the overspend by the present Prime Minister? The only way forward is for a people's vote.
Well, people voted in different ways in the referendum in 2016, that is obvious. But nobody voted to lose their jobs, to find their regulations had been damaged and their living conditions had been damaged. The function of Parliament is to hold the government to account and scrutinise this agreement. A bare-bones free trade agreement, which is what the Prime Minister is promising, would dramatically hit our country's GDP and would disproportionately hit the poorest regions and make everybody in this country worse off. And it would lock in the existing privatisation of our National Health Service, and nothing in this bill protects our health service or their public services from future trade deals.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend. Does he acknowledge that many EU nationals in this country are really afraid? Afraid because they don't know what their future is going to be. An Italian flower seller in a market in my constituency who's lived here 15 years, has been constantly asked, when are you going home? And today I've had an email from a doctor in the constituency who said there are significant concerns about the tardy response by the Brexit Department, for want of a better name for that organisation, in that there's been no confirmation of this German doctor's residency and his status going forward. He is obviously very anxious and distracted by the situation. We need to keep primary care morale up in the current difficult times, and our valued European doctors and nurses need to feel confident about their future within the UK. This doctor has been a cornerstone of the NHS in Wales for over 20 years. My right honourable friend knows very well we are losing doctors and nurses and we can't afford to do it.
I thank my friend for that intervention, and she says it with heartfelt passion, and she's right. There are many people that have come to this country from all over the world, made their homes here, made a massive contribution to our lives and our society, and every one of us owes our health to those people that work in our NHS, whether they come from Commonwealth countries, other countries, or the European Union, and they should not be put through the strain either of the Windrush hostile environment or indeed the sword of Damocles that's hanging over many at the moment, because they know they only have 5 years definite stay in this country. And I'll just remind the House, it was this party that in July 2016, Andy Burnham, then our Shadow Home Secretary, moved a motion guaranteeing permanent rights and residence of EU nationals. And the Prime Minister was the only Tory to support it at that time. I don't know what happened to him since then. So again, Mr. Speaker, on the subject of trade and investment, will the Chancellor do his job and provide the House with a comprehensive economic impact assessment on this deal? Or at the very least, will he do so before the report stage? This bill, Mr. Speaker, falls hugely short in all areas. I'm going to have given away a great deal, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure you will all agree, and I'll make some progress. Then I will give way to my friend over there and the member for Brighton. On jobs and manufacturing, this deal will reduce access to the market of our biggest trade partner and leave our manufacturers without a customs union. Members, as we've heard from many interventions, will have heard desperate pleas from businesses in their constituencies, all saying they need frictionless supply trains. So I ask them to do the right thing. Let's work together to make sure a comprehensive customs union is hardwired into our future relationship with the EU.
Jim Fitzpatrick.
Speaker, I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. He knows we disagree on elements of this bill and this issue. As his former whip, with my whip's tie on, can I ask him for an assurance that those members on this side of the chamber who exercise their conscience this evening and don't follow the whip will not have that whip removed any more than he had it removed when he exercised his conscience?
Mr. Speaker, I believe in the powers of persuasion. And tonight I would like to persuade my honourable friend. Come with us, vote against this bill and vote against the programme motion. Because I believe, and I think he may agree with me, it's actually in the interest of his constituents.
I'm grateful to the Leader of the Opposition for giving way. Does he share my concern that this Brexit deal could lead to a loss of freedom of movement within the island of Ireland for international family members of Irish or UK citizens? In other words, it imposes the equivalent of a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic, denying families their reunification rights. Will you acknowledge that this is a barely mentioned but still very worrying aspect of yet another way in which this deal breaches the Good Friday Agreement?
Yes, I understand and accept the member's concerns on this, and she's making very eloquently the case for far more scrutiny of this bill, so I'm sure she'll be joining me in opposing the programme motion this evening, because the programme motion will prevent just that kind of scrutiny. And I note from the programme motion there is only 1 hour allowed for consideration of all Lord's amendments, however many there may or may not be. And I will give way to my quiet and demeaning friend from the demeanour of my friend No, he's his demeanour, not demeanour. On workers' rights, by removing any level playing field provision, the government is asking us to give them a blank cheque at rights at work.
To the House. It's a great relief to the House. I was worried that the Honourable Gentleman might explode into the atmosphere, which would have been a most unfortunate scenario. Carl Turner.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend, the Leader of the Opposition, for eventually giving way. Mr. Speaker, I was incredibly concerned when I was reminded by my wife earlier today that my wife and I spent longer choosing a sofa than we have to debate this incredibly important bill. But the important point is this. The Prime Minister's own legislative advisor, Nikki DeCosta, has said and had advised him that she thinks this House needs at least 4 weeks to debate this important legislation in order for it to go through both houses. We just not got enough time to debate this. Would you agree?
Mr. Speaker, my friend makes a very strong point. We got the bill at 8:15 last night, and this afternoon at 1 o'clock we start debating it. It's ludicrous, utterly ludicrous. And then we're going into committee stage, and then it goes to the Lords, and then it comes back, as I said in response to the member from Brighton, for a 1-hour debate on Lords' amendments. These are serious issues that have huge implications for communities, factories, jobs, people. It shouldn't be dealt with in this way.
I'm very grateful for him giving way so many times. Over the last couple of years, members from across the House have asked many questions about the customs relationship between the EU and the UK post-Brexit, but nobody thought to ask a question whether customs arrangements within our own country would be effective. Well, doesn't the honourable gentleman agree with me that the Prime Minister should have, at that dispatch box, apologised to the businesses in Britain that trade within Britain and are now going to have to start filling forms out they never ever would have had to do so before?
Well, indeed, and that's just one aspect of this bill that has been revealed today, and I suspect there's much more that will come up. I do give way to a friend.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. One of the reasons why we need greater scrutiny is that the relationships in Northern Ireland fundamentally change the decision-making processes as a result of the bill. The stakes are so high, the risk is there evident for us all to see. Does he not agree that we need proper scrutiny and more time to consider this for the sake of peace?
Well, indeed, Mr. Speaker, the Northern Ireland peace process, the Good Friday Agreement, is one of the most significant things this House has ever done. And I think we should understand the threat that this brings. Mr. Speaker, I was speaking about workers' rights, and the government wants us to trust them on it. The provisions of this bill mean the government merely has to inform the House if they propose to diverge from EU standards. And am I correct in understanding that no notification, let alone a vote, would be required if the measure is currently contained in secondary legislation? The provisions fall way short of the workers' rights Maintenance of EU Standards Bill that my friend the member for Great Grimsby put forward, and the TUC concluded today, and I quote from them: "This deal does not meet the TUC's test that any Brexit outcome must protect jobs, rights and peace in Northern Ireland. By moving away from a close economic relationship with the EU, the deal would be a disaster for working people's jobs and livelihoods. The deal would not require..." I'm very surprised that the members opposite don't want to hear what the TUC says about this deal. The deal would not require government to maintain existing rights, would not require rights to keep pace with those across the EU, and would leave workers with significantly reduced ability to enforce the rights that they have. And concludes with saying it would do nothing to improve employment rights in the UK now or in the future. So, Mr. Speaker, on environment, they talk about maintaining world-class environmental standards, but actions speak louder than words. So can I ask Can I ask the Prime Minister? I'm not giving way for a while. So can I ask the Prime Minister, instead of entrenching non-regressional environmental standards into this bill and their deal, why has he instead taken out level playing field commitments? I always say, Mr. Speaker, on all these issues, you don't have to take my word for it. Manufacturers and industry are deeply concerned about this deal. Environmental campaigning groups, green groups, are deeply concerned. And I challenge the Prime Minister to name a single trade union in this country that backs this deal. He knows he can't, and they have made their views very clear, which the TUC... No, I won't give way. Mr. Speaker, that isn't all. What may be the most...
Order. The Leader of the Opposition has made clear that he's not giving way at the moment. There is a fine line between beseeching someone and hectoring, and members are in danger of falling on the wrong side of that dividing line. The Leader of the Opposition is entitled to continue with his speech, and he will do so until he is ready to give way. Mr. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister and I agree on very little, but we both gave way a great deal in our speech. And I'm not going to give way for the moment. That clause, Mr. Speaker, clause 30, makes it worryingly clear if no trade deal with the EU is agreed by the very ambitious date of December next year, ministers can just decide to crash out the UK on WTO terms. This, Mr. Speaker, is not getting Brexit done. It's merely pushing back the very serious threat of no deal to a later date. Let's be clear, as things stand, this bill spells out what is a deeply damaging deal that the Prime Minister has negotiated. And he knows it, which is why he's trying to push it through without scrutiny. So, Mr. Speaker, Labour will seek more time to scrutinise. We will seek a very clear commitment on a customs union, a strong single market relationship, hard-wired commitment on workers' rights, non-regression on environmental standards, and loopholes closed to avoid the threat of a no-deal Brexit once and for all. Lastly, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's deal should go back to the people and give them, not just the members of this House, the final say. They always say, Mr. Speaker, that the devil is in the detail. And having seen some of the detail, it confirms everything we thought about this rotten deal. A charter for deregulation across the board, paving the way for a Trump-style trade deal that will... No, they don't like hearing this bit, Mr. Speaker, so I'll say it again. Paving the way for a Trump-style trade deal that will attack jobs, rights and protections and open up our precious National Health Service and all the history and principles behind it and other public services to even more privatisation. This is exactly what the Prime Minister set out in his letter to the EU Commission President when he set out that alignment with EU standards, and I quote from the Prime Minister's letter, is not the goal of the current UK government. There you have it in his own words. It's a vision for the future of our country, Mr. Speaker, that my party, the Labour Party, cannot sign up to and does not support. That is why we will be voting against second reading tonight, and if that is carried, we will vote against the programme motion to ensure this elected House of Commons has the opportunity to properly scrutinise this piece of legislation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.